If you want to create a public subnetwork from scratch in AWS, it can be a little difficult because you have to create a VPC. You have to create a subnetwork within that VPC. You have to create an internet gateway. You have to add that internet gateway to a route table. All of those steps in their configuration require a little bit of practice, and for newbies, one thing that can be nice to get around worrying about those details is to use the VPC and more wizard. All right, let's go ahead and pretend right now that we want to create a new VPC to host a public website. If we go to the VPC dashboard and we click on Create VPC, there are two options. The default is VPC and more, and the other option is VPC only. So if I was going to create a whole new private network in my cloud account, I could just start with the VPC. I could give it a name, and I could choose one of the private IP address ranges, and commonly I would use /16 so that I have 65,536 different private IP addresses that I could use. I would subdivide this with subnetworks. I would add an internet gateway and a route table afterwards, but the VPC itself only requires just these settings in the form, which is not very much. However, since I have to do the other stuff, might as well use their wizard and get it done all at once. So let me click VPC and more. All right, so I've clicked VPC and more, and over on the left-hand side, I have a list of settings. There's a bunch of different parts here, and I'll talk about those shortly. And over here on the right-hand side, I have a preview of all of the resources that are going to be created. So right now, I can see that there's going to be a VPC, 4 subnets, 3 route tables, and a couple other services which is related to connecting to S3 and the internet gateway. Well, it's a lot of stuff. And I can actually show a little bit more detail related to these, such as what is the IP address range being used here, what's the availability zone that the different subnets are hosted in, etc., etc. Some of the rules that are set to the route table. Okay, lots of stuff. Let's come back over here and think about our use case. So let's go from top to bottom. First off, our project. Let's say that we're making a VPC for a website related to home builders. So I'll type in home builder, and you can see that it's changing the name that will be associated with each of the resources that are going to be created with the preview over here on the right. All right, next item, CIDR block. So again, I could use any of the ranges that are the private IP address ranges. So I could do like the 10s, the 172s, etc. And if I make it big enough, 16 is the maximum, I can have 65,536 IP addresses available for my subnets. All right, so that part right up here is the same as just the VPC only option. But let's go ahead and look at these other options. Okay, first question here is number of availability zones. So this is usually good for redundancy. Have potentially your future computers hosted in different data centers effectively. To simplify this, let's go ahead and just pretend that we're only going to use one data center for our one public website, just to make this a little easier. Okay, and when I do that, suddenly there were less options available here. Great. Now let's come down to subnets. How many subnets do I need? Well, I want one public subnet, meaning that it's reachable from the public internet to have a public website. And in terms of private subnets, let's say that I don't want any. I might use a private subnet if I had a database or something like that I wanted to not have it directly accessible from the world. All right, so having selected 0 subnets that are private and 1 that's public, now my preview has gotten a lot simpler. I'm going to remove one more thing. It already says no NAT gateway, we won't worry about that. And then there's something about data transfer back and forth to S3, and we're not going to worry about that right now. So I go none and none for both of those. And now let's look at the preview. Okay, if you remember what I said at the beginning, that if I have a public website, I need to have at least a VPC, a subnet within that VPC that is a subnetwork of the overall IP address range. I need a route table, and I need an internet gateway. So notice that by just clicking a couple of boxes here, I have set myself up to just click Create VPC, and it will create all 4 of those resources for me. And just as a side note, I'm in Ohio, and I'm in the US East 2A availability zone. So that's the region, and that's one of the available data centers that we can use. And if I wanted to, I could customize this. I could say, hey, let's select a different data center effectively. I can also do other things to customize the range that I'm using out of the overall global range. So I can do a couple customizations, but I won't worry about that. Let's go ahead and click Create VPC. And in 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 seconds, it created all kinds of stuff for us, and it did other helpful things like attaching the internet gateway to the VPC, etc., etc. So I click View VPC, and there it is. Okay, so how would we use this? Now that we have our own segmented network that's private and separate from everything else, let's go ahead and put an EC2 instance in there. So I'm going to use my little shortcut to get over to the EC2 dashboard. I'm going to click on Launch an Instance, and we'll call this Home Builder Site. I'll accept the defaults, a t2.micro. I will use one of my existing key pairs. Fair enough. And here's where you need to make a change. Typically, when you're creating EC2 instances, by default, it's going to try to put it into your default network. But as you experiment with your personal accounts and stuff like that, these things can be configured in all kinds of strange ways due to accidental changes that you've made. So it's better to have a separate network for a project. And in this case, we have our Home Builder website VPC. So I'm going to click Edit up here, and it's going to allow me to select the VPC that I just created. It's going to allow me to choose a subnet to put that EC2 instance into. I'm going to auto-assign it a public IP address. I will go with the default here to create a new security group, a new firewall rule, as follows. We're going to allow in port 22 traffic, and I suppose I could add in another rule for port 80, but I'll just pass on that for the moment. This is fine. Well, actually, no, let's go ahead and do it anyway. So I'm going to add in a rule, and I'll say, let's add in port 80 traffic, and we'll say we can have traffic coming from anywhere. Okay, great. All right, I'll leave the other defaults as they are. Over here on the right-hand side is a summary of what's about to be created. I click Launch Instance. And I want to go look at the details of my instance. Okay, and if I select this, notice the instance state is pending, but within a couple of seconds it'll be ready to go. But the important part is if I come down here under networking, that this instance has been created in my new VPC. It's using the subnet that I created as part of my wizard. So, and there's other things we could look at related to the route table and its rules and things like that, but just suffice to say, using the VPC wizard will allow you to create your infrastructure a lot easier than doing each of the networking parts by hand.